Thank you for joining our first roundtable. This one is called Harm Reduction in the Black Church. My name is Jose Martinez. I am the Hepatitis C and Harm Reduction Associate for National Harm Reduction Coalition. So this panel is brought to you by Faith in Harm Reduction and the National Harm Reduction Coalition. And this right here is our North Star statement, and it basically is a summary of what drives our work. And it says National Harm Reduction Coalition creates space for dialogue and action that helps heal the harms caused by racialized drug policies. And National Harm Reduction, we responsible for policy and advocacy, national and regional harm conferences, training and technical assistance. We assist agencies in becoming opioid overdose prevention programs. And on our website, you can download and or purchase some of our publications and resources. So just a little Zoom housekeeping, right? Like me, I have choppy internet service. So, sometimes I have to call in from my phone. And how you do that is on the bottom left-hand side of your screen, you have the microphone icon, and next to it, you have an arrow pointing down or pointing up. And what you do is you drag your mouse over that icon and you click switch to phone audio, and it'll display a few numbers depending on your region that you're living in. You call in and you dial our participant meeting ID and participant ID, and you can hear the webinar from your phone while viewing it from whatever device you're viewing it. So the chat box, like Sarah was telling the gentleman, it allows you to give a general statement, and it also allows you to directly message people. So feel free to just be mindful that whatever you write can be viewed after when we download the transcript. As far as viewing options, after we present these slides, you can have the option to change your view option from gallery, which will allow you to see more than 2 or 3 or 4 people in one time, or you can limit it to just the speaker view. And once again, a reminder, this webinar is being recorded and will be shared with all our participants, and a reminder that any private messages will be visible in the transcript later. And yes, please enjoy the conversation. And I think I'll pass it to Erica now.
Thank you so much, Jose, and thank you to each of you joining us here this afternoon. My name is Erica, and I'm the Director of Faith and Harm Reduction. We are thrilled to welcome you to the first event in our National Faith and Harm Reduction Roundtable series. For those not familiar with Faith and Harm Reduction, we are a collaborative project of the National Harm Reduction Coalition and Judson Memorial Church in New York City. As a national collective of faith and community leaders, we mobilize spirit, connection, and power in partnership with people who use drugs. We were born of the understanding that there was a call to build bridges between harm reduction and faith communities in order to develop leadership, strengthen harm reduction advocacy efforts, and build environments supportive of harm reduction in policy and practice. As a collective, we have arrived at the following mission, which guides the spirit of our work. Faith and Harm Reduction co-creates a justice movement which connects people who use drugs, people who do sex work, and communities of faith through the development of harm reduction-centered spiritual resources, ritual support, and spiritual care. Today's webinar, like all of our efforts, is very much a work of love. And this space was made possible by an incredible team of panelists, technical support, Faith and Harm Reduction staff, and in largest measure, our Faith and Harm Reduction leadership team. Today, our conversation will be led by an incredibly impressive list of harm reduction leadership from across the country, including the Reverend Dr. Arisha Bowers and Hiawatha Collins from National Harm Reduction Coalition, Reverend Dr. Earl Fisher from Abyssinian Missionary Baptist Church, Cherise Scott with Sister Reach, Jawanza Williams from Vocal New York. Following the panelists, there will be a time for questions and answers. We invite you to add questions to the chat at any point throughout, and we look forward to being in conversation with you. So thank you all for joining us in this movement here today on this webinar. We welcome you, and we welcome you to connect with Faith and Harm Reduction and our collective work for liberation. And with this, I will turn it over to my beloved colleague and friend, Dr. O.
Greetings, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us. For this moment, I would like to ask us to first, if we are able, close our eyes and take 3 collective breaths together. On your inhale for the first breath, I invite you to breathe in solidarity. And on your exhale, breathe out discord. On your second breath, I invite you to breathe in love. And on your exhale, breathe out any kind of dis-ease or displeasure. And finally, on the third breath, I invite you to breathe in. Breathe in what it is that you need personally in this moment. And on your exhale, breathe out what does not serve you in this moment. I'm going to read to you a short poem by Adrienne Marie Brown called Liberation. I can only do something small. The ripple still reaches the shore. When we meet, you are a stranger, but I knew you, and you become beloved. The days are all too heavy, and then we lift together. We need everything to be different, so we change. I thought this was too shattered, but I am whole. We are whole. This is whole. We seek a way through to heaven. We find we each have our own way. Liberation by Adrienne Marie Brown. For today's conversation, we're here today to discuss the opportunities and challenges existing in the space where harm reduction meets with the Black church. Knowing and going fully informed into this conversation that the two are not monolithic. And with that, we'll start to hear from our panelists. Our first panelist for today, and each panelist, just so everyone knows what's happening next, each panelist will share with us their thoughts. Excuse me, I think are you all able to hear me?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. All right. Each panelist will share with us their thoughts on the intersections of harm reduction in the Black church. Our first panelist for today is Reverend Dr. Earl J. Fisher, a movement and ministry leader in Memphis, Tennessee and beyond, who received his PhD in communication from the University of Memphis in 2018 and teaches religious studies, communication, and African American studies at several local colleges and universities. Pastor Earl is also the senior pastor of Abyssinian Baptist Church in Memphis, Tennessee, and founder of Up the Vote 901, a nonpartisan voter empowerment initiative committed to expanding political power and increasing voter turnout in Memphis and Shelby County. Dr. Fisher is the 2019-2020 Henry Logan Stark Fellow at Memphis Theological Seminary and the Political Science Research Fellow at the University of Memphis. Most of Dr. Fisher's work focuses on Black rhetoric, Black preaching, Black radical politics, and the work of Reverend Albert Cleage Jr. Dr. Fisher, will you share with us?
Good afternoon. Thank you, Dr. O. It's a pleasure to be with you. For those who don't know, Dr. O had a stint through Abyssinian, so it's good to be back in a safe and sacred space with her. But to all of the organizers of this wonderful event, to my co-panelists and the co-laborers in the faith and in the movement, again, thank you. It is good for us to be here. I enter this conversation with a deep level of appreciation for faith and harm reduction as an organization that I am continuing to learn more about. I also enter this as has been stated, a pastor of a Black church in Memphis, Tennessee. As a matter of fact, we are affectionately referred to as the Blackest Church in Memphis and Shelby County because of our commitment to social justice and Black liberation unapologetically. So that's a title that we wear proudly, but also as the founder of Up the Vote 901, which is a nonpartisan collaborative that seeks to give more power, information, and representation to more people and increase voter turnout in Memphis and Shelby County in every election. So there are a couple of places where I feel like my personal mission and ministerial and movement leadership overlap with some of the values of faith and harm reduction. I'll share two, and then I'll relieve the balance of my time because I'm more concerned about us getting into this robust conversation than I am about laying out some of the work that I'm involved in. But two of the values I think are in alignment with what I'm trying to do and what I'm committed to and what my convictions are. One is the multiple pathways to healing, and the other is liberation. I say the multiple pathways to healing because I think in order for us to engage in the type of healing work of harm reduction, we have to center some of the sources of so much of the harm. And I think the harm is a byproduct of so much poor, regressive, exploitative public policy, which is to say we don't have the luxury of simply situating ourselves in sanctuaries that are rooted in communities that are impacted by public policy without gauging in the type of work from a faith-based perspective that tries to challenge the public policies to be more righteous, more robust, and more relevant to the lives of the people. But so much of our public policy is rooted in white supremacist ideology and theology with a logic, if you will, towards anti-Blackness. So part of what I'm trying to preach about, part of what I'm trying to promote as a pastor, part of what I'm trying to produce as a movement leader is the level of engagement that people have and a certain type of enlightenment that leads to the type of healing and liberation that faith and harm reduction is committed to. Lastly, I'll say it's important as a pastor to recognize the multiple pathways of healing because white supremacist theology leads us to believe it's only one pathway to God, and that must be ours. And it must be articulated the way we articulate it. It must be expressed the way we express it. It must be embodied the way we embody it. And I just feel like that is so counterproductive to the healing that so many of our people need. And for me, liberation as a student of and practitioner of Black liberation theology, I come to understand liberation not simply as emancipation or freedom from some form of oppression. It's also emancipation and empowerment. It is to say that we need to be empowered with the type of tools, type of knowledge, and the type of skills that allow us to live life in that more abundantly. So again, I'm excited to be a part of this conversation. I owe y'all an offering for letting me go first, because now I don't have to be weighed up against these other heavyweights in terms of all of the work that they're doing. But I especially look forward to this robust conversation. And again, thank y'all for having me.
Thank you, Dr. Fisher. Next, our speaker is Cherise Scott. Cherise is the CEO and founder of Sister Reach, a grassroots nonprofit based in Memphis, Tennessee, that supports the reproductive autonomy of women and teens of color, poor and rural women, LGBTQIA+ people, and their families through the framework of reproductive justice. Cherise has worked in the reproductive justice movement for 15 years and has led her team to achieve a strong presence regarding their education, policy, and advocacy, culture change, and harm reduction work for the most vulnerable Tennesseans. I give you Cherise Scott.
Thanks so much, Dr. O, for that introduction, and I'm really excited to be a part of this panel. Definitely excited to have this type of a conversation today. Um, so you definitely learned about, who Sister Reach is and what it is that we focus on as a highlight of our work. But I want to also speak to the framework in which we do our work from, which is reproductive justice, a term that was coined in 1994 by 12 Black women to create and center the lived experiences of Black women around issues of reproductive and sexual health. That work is definitely grounded in womanist theory, if you will. Though that was not necessarily the intention, it absolutely overlaps thinking about who we are, not just in our minds and in our bodies, but how we enter into the world and navigate the world from a spiritual point of view, and the responsibility of our community to not only address our physical needs, but to also consider how that impacts our minds and how that impacts our spirituality. I think what the pieces that I want to lift up, in how I'm entering into this conversation as the daughter of a person who uses drugs, and how that work has impacted my life and some of the work that I do at this organization. But I also want to lift up, the concern for the culture of care, and which has been curated by medical providers at the intersection of their work and their faith, and how that often sometimes marginalizes folks who are ill, especially folks who navigate harm reduction issues and through implicit bias, often racial profiling and stereotyping, and using the ways in which they would offer care through this religious liberty lens that centers their needs and not necessarily is patient-centered, loving, compassionate, forgiving, and even situated to kind of emancipate folks from and invite folks into an abundant type of care scenario. And then the church's obligation really to curate brave and safe spaces for healing, abundance, and deliverance, especially for folks who, definitely with our work around substance use disorder, sexually transmitted infections, abortion access, reproductive and sexual health care education access, and just really thinking about creating these different types of opportunities that, folks that walk through the doors are people who have sex at church, folks who walk through the doors are people who've been raped and molested, right? Folks who use drugs as a way to medicate some of those ills, as well as folks who are often left with their backs against the wall and have no opportunity to figure out how to live, but through potentially engaging in sex work. Folks who are living with HIV, folks who identify as LGBTQ, IA, Two-Spirit, right? And needing to have a safe space, a place where they can be restored, as well as a place that they can worship. And so I want to definitely lift up these kind of thought processes as we think about our conversation today, but then also to center that in the fact that we are all divine beings, and that we all deserve an opportunity at abundance, and that it is not to be impeded upon by any person, and especially in situations like engaging in the Black church, or being a church member, being a laity, being clergy, however, seminarian, theologian, however we enter into our kind of faith beliefs and how we engage with people. So I'll stop there.
Thank you, Cherise. Our next speaker is Jawanza Williams. Jawanza is a Black radical queer prison abolitionist, feminist, Christian engaged in social critique, local and state politics in New York City. He is currently the director of organizing at Vocal New York, a grassroots organization building power among poor and low-income New Yorkers. He is also a member of the Democratic Socialists of America and a founding member of Afro Socialists and Socialists of Color Caucus. Jawanza.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate that introduction. And of course, I just wanted to say thank you to everybody that's here to have this conversation. This is actually the kind of thing that I want to talk about, the multidimensional realities of what we are experiencing in this world as people, in particular as people that use drugs or those that serve people that use drugs, that we need to be talking about God and how God shows up in this space and how God herself loves people that use drugs and, people that are engaged in sex work, people of, different socio-political backgrounds, et cetera, that we need to be centering our policies around the sort of the complexity of what it means to be a human being, what it means to organize ourselves. So of course, I come into this conversation both as a Christian, but as an organizer. I work at Vocal New York, as was noted. I know Hiawatha, who we're gonna hear from as well, is a board member of Vocal and also one of the long-term leaders of the Drug Users Union. So we organized this users union made up of people that are active in former drug users who are impacted by problematic drug policy, namely prohibition, and the sort of psychic ideas that we have to collectively hold that dehumanize people that use drugs. So a lot of the work that Vocal New York does is not just about uprooting stigma and dealing with all of these sort of like deeply problematic ideas that are, as was mentioned by Reverend Fisher, like that white supremacist ideology and frameworks of reality are informing the way that we structure our society. The very institutions that are foundational to the democratic experiment that is the United States of America are informed by these ideas. And unfortunately, drug users, people that use drugs, are oftentimes the scapegoat for a lot of the problems that our society is experiencing. So I wanted to be here mostly to talk with those of us who are, of faith traditions, especially who come from theologies that are open and abundant and loving, but to remind us that our conversation about harm reduction, about the realities of drug user rights and drug user dignity, have to also be centered in the same degree that we talk about all of the progressive issues that the sort of progressive church is leading right now. When I look at repairs of the breach, when I think about New York's own LGBTQ faith leaders of African descent, when I think about the Poor People's Campaign, I am so excited and energized because we are taking back these narratives, these ideas about, well, what does God call us to do? And what is God doing in the world? And what is God saying in the world today? And, so for too long, white supremacist conservative theology has dominated this field, and it's created the conditions where our movements are devoid of any sort of spiritual understanding or sort of spiritual analysis or the spiritual dimension of what's at play. And there's this idea that Christianity and some of the bigger the primary religions in the world, Islam, Judaism, and Christianity are somehow not aligned with our visions, our abolitionist futures, our socialist futures, because that's not the case. And I think that when we start to talk about drug user rights and drug user health, we can begin to have that conversation. So I'm here to really call on those of us who are practicing, faith traditions, who are trying to build out loving communities and loving theology and understandings and arguments for us to adopt the cause of harm reduction, to understand harm reduction is both simultaneously a methodology of medical practice even, but it is simultaneously an orientation, an ideology, the idea that people that use drugs are human beings worthy of all of the things that we want for ourselves and for our communities. And if we are to affirm that Black Lives Matter, we have to affirm that Black Lives Matter even when we use drugs. And I'll leave it here, but I just want to say that we want to be building out policy structures, policy directions that create and maintain safety for the most vulnerable people. And let me tell you, that means that we need to defund the police. That means we need to tax billionaires and millionaires and redistribute wealth and power in this society. And, when I think about safety and how we define safety, how we define, name, and maintain safety, I think about the most vulnerable. And when I say that, who I mean, the best way I can say it today in the United States is I'm talking about a Black trans woman who's engaged in sex work, who's an active drug user, who's experiencing homelessness. Whenever I ask her, what are the top things that you need to find safety? I guarantee you the police will not be on that list. And I think that we need to be thinking about everything that we do, even our theology, the stories we sort of translate scripture, translate ideas for the modern day, that we are saying that with a full awareness and compassion extended further than ever before towards including those who are most vulnerable. Because for me, as a person that is not a minister, but I follow the Bible and its stories from a Black liberationist perspective, and aided heavily by Reverend Jackie Lewis of Middle Collegiate Church, very helpful there for me. and also other faith leaders, not even just from Christians, but you know, I think about the central story of Christ. The central story that found in the Gospels is a challenge of empire, a challenge of imperialist ideas, a challenge to all of us to remember that we have to bring to the center of our conversations, our analysis, and ultimately our worship of God, by loving and taking care of our most vulnerable. And for us today, we're talking about people that use drugs.
Thank you so much, Jawanza. The final panelist, the Hiawatha Collins. Hiawatha is the Harm Reduction Community Mobilization Coordinator with National Harm Reduction Coalition. Hiawatha is a beloved community member, leader, father to many, brother to many, and force to be reckoned with. Hiawatha.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for that introduction. As you already heard, I'm also a board member of Vocal New York, and I wear many other hats. Just one thing I want to say, and thank you to the panelists and everything that y'all have brought to this discussion. The one thing that I want to talk about is harm reduction and the Black church. Harm reduction in the Black church consists of one word. That word is love. When we talk about harm reduction and the Black church, if we center that around love, we will talk about the inclusion of the most vulnerable people. We will talk about going out and helping the homeless. We will talk about the inclusion of drug users and sex workers. In harm reduction, we go out with a non-judgment, and we treat people with dignity and respect. And we try to build a rapport with them so that way we can reach some of the most marginalized people on the fringe of our societies. I do not want to think that the Black church has forgotten this, because we wear $1,000 suits coming to church. We step over the homeless individuals and we look down and we forget that we don't feed the homeless anymore. We don't help the person in the church who has no male figure in her life, but is bringing 3 kids up by herself and need to pay bills. How is she paying bills, but we asking them to put $100 in a plate? What's so important about that $100? And I understand that the church has bills, but I do understand that people are hungry. I do understand that we have marginalized people out in the community that need help, that we turn our back on because they believe that we're holier than thou. And this is not a condemnation of the Black church. This is a plea for inclusion, to practice harm reduction and bring harm reduction into the church and show how we can help the most vulnerable people. And that is the mission. At least I thought it was. If I could just touch the hem of his garment, what did that mean? If I have faith enough to just touch the hem of his garment, I'll be healed. I will not be. But wait a minute, we have people out there in society who believe the same, but we don't know what they went through. We don't know what they're going through, but they may be using drugs. But the only thing we see is the fact that they're using drugs and that they're homeless. We don't know why they're homeless. But have we ever tried to extend our helping hand? Have we ever tried to change the laws and policies that get people evicted for unnecessary and unnecessary reasons? But if we look at the history of this country, we will see that these policies were racist in its inception. I'm talking about redlining. I'm talking about the inflated loans for Black people to minority folks to get housing and pay their bills, to live equally. I said to live equally, but it's not equality that we want, it's equity. It's so far gone that we will never be equal, but we need to strive for equity. And we need to have a change in these policies. When the police force was created, nobody looked like me were on the police force because they were a slave catching force at that time. So how can you tell me that these policies that they have in place were meant for us? The inclusion of us. Anything that we're not a part of creating, we need to tear down and rebuild. We can't just tear it down. We need to rebuild and put it with something that is most divine, most great, better. Harm reduction is about helping people. But in harm reduction, when you help people, you don't just dictate to them what they should be doing. You don't talk down to them. You include them in the conversation. You build them up. The church used to do that. Used to go out and get folks on the corner, bring them in, feed them, build them up, let them know that this is a place of sanctuary and a place of safety. I don't care what you did out there, but in here, you're safe. What happened to those days? What happened to the people that were like that loved their fellow man, fellow person? This harm reduction and Black church movement is about humanity, it's about love, and it's about inclusion. And we have to include everyone to get to where we have to get to, but we have to remember that these policies, these racist policies that keep communities oppressed and separated, those have to be addressed. And we can no longer sit back idly and think that they're just gonna go away. We have to vote people out of office, not just because we know that we're gonna vote for them. If they're not for us, they're against us. And this is the thing. You can tell a society by how it treats its most vulnerable people. Well, how would I judge this society? And the shame of it is, I'm a former Marine. I served my country. To come back to this country after serving this country and to see how it treats folks and how it treated me, myself, is appalling. But let's just talk about love, like I started. Love and harm reduction in the Black church for humanity, for a better way, for equity, for better policies. If we stand by and look and just watch, we're just as guilty as the oppressor or the person cracking the whip. Now, a lot of these things we have to do united together. But the one thing that we must do is we must create for ourselves, with ourselves. There's no way in the world we can go to Massa and tell Massa, stop cracking the whip, Massa, it hurt my back. He know it hurts our back. He's trying to get us to do what we don't want to do or what he needs us to do. But what he needs us to do is not always right for us. And he's not going to stop cracking the whip. So why do we continue to go and ask someone to make changes that we know they're not going to do? Put the people in office, vote people in office, register to vote, make these changes, and put people in that are going to do what you need them to do. No longer can we just be the minority vote for this person or that person. No longer can we just vote down party lines, because when you vote down party lines, you see what they're doing. They're just voting down party lines and they're not doing what they're supposed to be doing. A government of the people, serving the people. Everything is big corporations and it's not about the wealth, the middle class, the wealth and the growing of said people. Look what happens in this country just for the past 4 years. And it showed you a lot. It shows you how racist this country still is. And do we believe that one election is just going to change things? Because now things have been set in motion. We have to align together and make changes and show people that what we have been doing for so long. What we have been doing for so long is what? Turning the other cheek. We have been not only turning the other cheek, but we have been giving them the other cheek and showing people that we are a people of love and compassion. And we can continue to do that, but we need to continue to do things, but be able to stand up. There's nothing wrong with standing up and saying, I'm Black and I'm proud. I'm Hispanic and I'm proud. I'm LGBTQ and I'm proud. It's whatever, I'm proud. But we can do this together and create the laws that we need to create so that we can do this thing holistically, together, in unity and in love. And I'm gonna enjoy this conversation that we're about to have and get into. Thank you very much for your time. I appreciate and love you all. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Haya. So we'll transition into our conversation. This first question is directed to each member of the panel. How do you define and/or integrate harm reduction into your work within your church or your organization? And whoever on the panel would like to begin can start.
I could start. And of course, thank you, Hiawatha. I should note that I like my relationship to harm reduction has grown over the years. I also sort of like similar to Charisse, you know, there's like drug use in my family, and whenever I learned of these things, I didn't really have a framework to respond. All I had known was, you know, sort of interventionist perspectives that I learned from TV that I don't have to tell anybody here, I don't think, that they did not work, the things that I tried. But I later, thankfully, learned about harm reduction, and because of folks like Hiawatha and the Drug Users Union at Vocal, it was really profound, and I'm very grateful that I was offered up this sort of perspective. So I'll say that to say that for me, I mean, harm reduction is all that Vocal is framed around. Everything that we do, especially our Drug Users Union, our policy platforms, it's like harm reduction isn't just about your behaviors and how you show up, and whenever you open your church doors, who walks in and how you treat them. That's important, of course, because that's the entry point to engage. But you know, harm reduction is about meeting immediate needs as well. It's about responding to catastrophe. You know, I think a lot about movement building. And one of the things I have to tell folks who have issues with sort of reform campaigns or campaigns that aren't, you know, directly abolitionists, or they don't understand the connections, you know, movement building is about building power. And movements are the only things that ever change the, you know, the circumstances of a society. You know, Jesus was a movement builder. And you can't build a movement with many, many people if your people are dead. So we need safer consumption spaces. We need access to medication-assisted treatment. We need access to sterile syringes and the host of tools people need to be able to use drugs safely, because we need them to be alive so that we can build the power that we need to transform our society in the first place. So with that said, I do think that there's movements include everybody in the society, and we need our faith institutions to be heavily engaged, not just in cultural shifts. That's imperative. That's the best thing that they can do, really. But we also need churches to be participating in the organizing and the movement building. We need churches and faith organizations and faith configurations to be moving legislation, moving policies, so that we can improve the conditions of people that use drugs across our states. And, you know, and I think one way to start doing that, I was trying to start doing that at Middle before COVID. And then of course, if you don't know, Middle's church on 2nd Avenue in the Lower East Side of Manhattan burned down late last year. It was a really devastating thing, but you know, we are still here. You know, our church is not our building, but it was a devastating thing. But I'm starting to have these conversations at church about harm reduction, about drug use and health, and in particular with Black people in this country who are, you know, looking at the world through these eyes where they remember, and mind you, I'm growing up in this period, or not even born for a lot of it, where the way that the crack epidemic, they call it, you know, was treated, and how the stories that we told, the narratives that were constructed, the policy responses, the sort of doubling down of prohibitionist frameworks, and you know, the increasing of mass incarceration and the drug war being used as a primary vehicle to facilitate that incarceration. It required a sort of like a cultural framework that suggested that people that use drugs were the cause of the problems that the vast majority of Black people, in particular in cities, were experiencing, which are really problems that are the cause of austerity, the elimination of social and economic supports for low income and working people, like cutting food stamps, like back to work programs, you know, like the elimination of public housing, like the elimination of Section 8 vouchers, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And of course, all of this is happening on city and federal levels simultaneously and state levels simultaneously. And it's leading to this idea in many Black people's understanding of like, when they're looking around what's happening in their communities, I mean, they see violence and poverty, etc., and then the drugs are there. So they believe, because of all the stories being told, all of the policy construction, all of the austerity, that if we just solve this drug problem, we get these people out of our communities, we'll solve our issues. We've been doing that for 40 years. The drug war has costed trillions of dollars. It's incarcerated millions upon millions of people. We still have the same problems. And that's because the drugs are not the issue. And so I think that it's important that, and I'll leave it here. One of the things, and I can talk more about it explicitly, even with you offline, if you're a faith person and you want to get more involved in organizing, I will talk to you about this. But one of the big pieces that we do at Vocal New York, we do institutional organizing as well. So what does it mean to open up your church to organizers who are working to dismantle the drug war, to end overdose, to open up your church for political teachings, to create a bridge between movement or politics and spirituality? Because that's what we're supposed to be doing. We're not supposed to be these passive people, these passive things. When Jesus turns the other cheek, the idea isn't to like ignore the problems. It's to have a righteous indignation towards injustice. It's like, oh, I'm going to pass safer consumption spaces. I'm going to make sure that people have access to syringe programs. And if you say it's illegal, I'm going to turn the other cheek, hit me again all you want to, but I'm going to do the thing that has to happen because it's a holy thing to create a state or to have a laws that reflect the great dignity and the divinity of human beings. So I feel like the work that we're doing here in movement work, I don't always lead with this argument because I don't want to be discounted. I'm not the faith leader in the room. But another thing that drives my values, even my socialist politic, my abolitionist politic, is this understanding that God would not create the world and he would not create conditions for us to experience structural suffering. And it's our responsibility to lift up our hands in defense of people. And that's what I'm going to continue to do.
Thank you so much. I want to pass the mic on to one of the other panelists, reminding you that the question was, how do you define and integrate harm reduction into your work at your church or organization?
I'll jump in here. So I work at Sister Reach. We work from a 4-pronged strategy, but one of those strategies is harm reduction. And some of that work, the more secular pieces of that work, if you will, are our Safe Sex Kids program, where we're doing that online. And before COVID, we were making sure that folks, anybody, young people or adults, could come to Sister Reach and get what they needed without shame, without, they didn't have to pay anything like that. They also could come and get free HIV testing, something that we hope to be able to get back going as soon as it is a little bit safer to open our doors. We had an opportunity to redirect a lot of our general support funding back into the Memphis community last year with our COVID-19 emergency fund. And we're able to move dollars into the hands of churches, organizations, and coalitions of folks who were working on the ground, because we couldn't serve everybody, nor could we access everybody, and with the kind of understanding of COVID-19, just to make sure that folks who trusted those partners could receive those resources from those partners. Especially when I think about churches, I know that we also partner with Dr. Earl's church to do that as well. And then we do a considerable amount of research. And once when Dr. O was working here at Sister Reach, we were able to conduct research on the impact of the fetal assault law that put drug-using mothers in prison instead of into behavioral health and mental health care, and expanding that health care to ensure that they could get the support that they need, but it also did not ensure that they would be able to keep their children. And unfortunately, that impacted Black mothers here in Memphis more so than in mothers across the state, though the issue was happening mostly in East Tennessee with drug-using mothers who were using opioids and who were also identified as white, while Black mothers in Memphis were losing their children indefinitely for smoking weed. And so, that for us was an injustice in and of itself, right? So we definitely wanted to kind of lift up that impact and also create an opportunity for folks who were impacted by the bill to be able to share their stories and recommendations to lawmakers and to policymakers, the drug court, the DA, about what they thought needed to be the best strategy in order to achieve the support that, or to receive their support that they needed, and really shift the culture around the ways that they were being engaged on the local and the state level. We work a lot with churches, just as a, just moving a little bit deeper into like the work that we do. But even before that, on the federal level, we're working right now to ensure that the Religious Freedom Restoration Act, that religious liberties aren't used as a weapon of harm, to just remove people's human rights across issues, right? But very specifically LGBT issues, reproductive and sexual health, reproductive justice, health or rights issues, just to make sure that, that understanding that we are in a state that is considered a Republican state or a red state, or a supermajority Republican state, where the majority of our politicians in the state legislature identify as Christian. And so then as a Christian, and also as an ordained minister in the non-denominational church, which I think was potentially an act of harm reduction in and of itself, not to kind of be caught in the crosshairs of denominational issues, it has been a way that, we've been lifting up and really putting the mirror on the hypocrisy of dealing with people from a space of shame and blame, instead of love and inclusion, and trying to, and really, let's put, especially since these folks predominantly identify as Christian, well, let's put Christ back into the way that you are, forming public policy, the ways that you are harming people with legislative violence, and calling that out, right? As well as, their voting record and policy crafting record of how they form public policy against folks. That does cut SNAP benefits and other social safety net supports, that does kick kids off of teen care, that will leave people sick and dying who cannot access healthcare because they cannot afford it, that will address why will the governor not, raise the minimum wage to $15, and yet you want to, in the same voice, shame and blame folks for not being able to be there for these children, be there to take care of their kids, and then you racially profile the kids, even if we are at home and if we do send them to school, and hopefully they make it home. But we've seen more than not, over and over again, across this country, across the state, and definitely in Memphis and places like Chattanooga and Nashville, where Black folks are racially profiled all the time by people who call themselves loving God, right? By people who profess to be Christian, right? And so we work with churches, we do the brave work, right? Of working with them and challenging them to shift the ways that they're talking about biblical scripture from the pulpit, to be inclusive around self-determination and bodily autonomy, things that we see, that we see in scripture. That we see the way that the ministry of Jesus was definitely centered in self-determination, bodily autonomy, centering women, centering the disenfranchised, centering the sex worker, however, right? Centering those that would be put into these buckets of sin, and really challenging them to do that brave thing, even if it goes against the doctrine, even if it means, unfortunately, that you might lose your seat as pastor. The people didn't call you, God called you. Do the work, the people will come, right? So that work continues to be the way that we try to move, here at Sister Reach, and how I try to move in my personal life. We don't just do the work, we are the work, we are the people that we serve. We are unapologetically Black. The majority of us at this organization are unapologetically Christian. And though we don't enforce our beliefs on anybody else, we also will not be forced, right, by anyone not to do this work that we believe is God work that we believe is ministry work, work that we know aligns with my own personal faith beliefs and the ways that I think Jesus operated in the world. It's very important to me to model what Christianity needs to look like in work, in deed, in my lived experience, in my life, and in practice, and how we care for people and how we want to be cared for. So definitely want to lift those things to the top, and I'll pass it to another panelist.
Cherise, there's actually a follow-up question for you from the audience. In your work with other Black clergy in Tennessee, do you get much pushback regarding them to see all marginalized people as God's people?
Absolutely, absolutely, especially because of the ways that people think about queer folk, for example, right? And whether or not that's supposed to be sin, or people who use drugs, or people who have had abortions, right? Yes, we absolutely do. And sometimes some of those folks will engage us privately and support us privately and won't necessarily do it publicly because they got something on the line to lose. Now, as much as I'm saying, that I want pastors to go renegade out here, I do recognize that's how folks eat, right? And so, we don't shame folks for where they are in the positions in which they try to engage or, secretly engage with us. But what we have been hoping to do is to continue to kind of build, or create this or curate this opportunity for clergy across our state and even those across the country who work with us to be more bold, to stand up together, to connect to other national work and state-based and regional work where there are more progressive voices, folks who who have a little bit more autonomy and don't have so much to lose. Like, those are the people normally that we're like, well, then can you be the spokesperson then in some ways, right? Not asking folks to collar up, right? But asking folks, to definitely at least try to move forward and engage in ministry in a way, that is resistance, right? Jesus also was a resistor, of the law, right? So how do we then, try to continue to work with folks and invite folks, to do that brave work and step out, on faith, right? And attempt to help fight for the least of these, to fight for their neighbor, to decenter themselves and their own personal piety in service to somebody, to another soul, right? I mean, as much as I want to talk about life, I'm far more interested in talking about souls, and especially in a context like this. And I think that we've gotten off that conversation a bit too much in trying to build, brick and mortar and trying to build mega churches. And we've lost sight of the goal here of what this was really supposed to be about. We're trying to do kingdom building here, right? And so we're building kingdom, then that's got to be, without all of the form and the fashion and the ways that we've seen people be harmed. Because we are far more concerned about how people think about how we live and what we believe and how we move and engage in the world than we do about, for those of us who identify as Christian, then our Savior thinks about how we engage through the world. So,
Dr. Earl.
Yeah, so there's a lot that's on the table that I kind of want to try to respond to. So let me reclaim some of the time that I left on the table during my introduction, and try to take my time and run across some of these things. My most simple and concrete answer to the questions in terms of what are we doing or what do we do, and at the risk of sounding self-indulgent, and I'm probably not that good at marketing and media with regards to all of the stuff that Abyssinian has been involved in, or all the stuff that I've been involved in. Here's my simple and concise answer. So what Jawanza was describing as it relates to like churches opening up their doors to activism and stuff like that, Abyssinian was surveilled by the Memphis Police Department because of our role in organizing. You know what I'm saying? I was on a blacklist in the city of Memphis, and I was under surveillance. Like, they had a whole dossier, what they call a joint intelligence briefing that they were sending out because of our engagement in organizing. So it's probably not many levels of organizing on issues relative to labor, criminal justice reform, reproductive justice. Part of what I do, I follow Charisse lead, right? That's a lot of that. We done partnered on stuff over almost 10 years now. You know what I'm saying? From Bible studies to press conferences to legislation that we've advocated for, all of that stuff. So those things are kind of sort of on the table insofar as like what we do, and I try to do it under the auspices of trying to provide for the community a avenue, a platform, and an institution that's committed to the things that are most deeply impacting Black folks. So let me put that on the side. So that's the direct answer to the question. The other elements in the conversation that I want to try to address, I see from two perspectives. One is a philosophical perspective, and the other is a more practical perspective. So from the philosophical perspective, when Jawanza was talking, I'm gonna call him Reverend Jawanza. Like, you know, I'm gonna have your pastor ordain you, okay? In a Baptist church, you know, they just write you a letter. Like, you ain't gotta go through all of that other stuff. You just write you a letter. But when Jawanza was talking about, and we actually talked about this on our prep call the other day too. So we know that there's some philosophical inconsistencies with how people respond to the harm that gets done in certain communities, because as Jawanza was articulating, when it was the crack epidemic, it was prohibition, it was tough on crime, it was jailing, it was mass incarceration. But when it's opioids that disproportionately impact white folks, now you got social services. Now you got conversations not about prohibition, you got conversations about regulation. This is a philosophical thing. Now it has some practical implications. I'm coming to that in a second, in particular, how that relates to the Black church. But, you know, knowing that this is philosophical takes me back to what I said during my introduction, that part of the philosophy is rooted in a white evangelical theology. And one of the things the white evangelical theology does, Hiawatha, is take love as you prescribed it, but make it about charity and not justice. So it takes this idea of love. Yeah, you niggas can come into the sanctuary, but you're gonna have to conform and assimilate to the respectability politics that undergird our white evangelical theology. So no, you can't use drugs. No, you can't say nigga in the pulpit. No, you don't cuss and say shit and all this other type of stuff, right? So that's, again, philosophical, but now moving into the more practical, because here's some of our challenges. When I say our now, I'm talking about those of us who have a relationship with the Black church, or who at least want to try to provide some type of analysis for the Black church. I was moderating a panel discussion yesterday, a plenary, at the Samuel DeWitt Proctor Conference. It's virtual this year. So if y'all don't know about the Samuel DeWitt Proctor Conference, please Google it. You know, Google will be your friend. It is probably, to me, the premier platform for social justice and Black liberationist preachers and academicians, and lay people too. The panel was faith communities as centers of community development and pillars for movement building, right? And part of what we had to get into are the perspectives that people bring to what the church ought to do or how the church ought to be. And part of what I think happens, and I got this sense a little bit when Hiawatha was talking about pastors with the $1,000, you know, whatever, you know, versus the people in the pews. And this is true to an extent and a degree. It's not the majority though. The majority of the pastors are not riding around in Benzes, right? The majority of the pastors, studies show, are bivocational, which is to say they ain't really making much money off the church. So it ain't so much that perception for me, it is the practical theology that they preach is so white and evangelical that they ultimately advance in the cause of white supremacy in their theology. Because now they're not talking about the concrete realities of harm reduction. They ain't, you know, they ain't so much as flamboyant or as flossy as Creflo or whoever else, right? But they are still articulating certain things about God that goes against what Jawanza was trying to propose, what Charisse would say, things that you would hear coming out of the pulpit regularly at Abyssinian. I'll say this lastly, we might have to redress it at some point, but I think it's important too, because it shifts us back to, if you're going to be a liberationist, you have to analyze the power dynamics in a social and political context. And you have to try to tilt your angst, your anger, your holy rage, and your holy hope or influence on that thing that has the most leverage or the most power. So at the risk of sounding erroneous, indulge me. There was a conversation that happened at the Potter's House a couple years ago. It had Paula White, T.D. Jakes, and all this other, you know, all of the classic, you know, coons and you know, before all this other stuff. But there was a section that they did was like, can prophetic voices impact policy and shape political agendas? And T.D. Jakes actually lifted something up that I wish it got more traction. It kind of did. Maybe y'all seen this snippet, because he made a profound point. He said, if you just do the math, if all you do is angle the churches that get 10% of people's income, voluntary, by the way, that's my addendum, not his, versus the government who takes it at a 35% rate. If you canceled every church, if you added up every church budget, and if nobody paid no staff, if nobody had a building, if nobody took up an arm, and if you gave it all to the poor, we still would not be solving the problem. We would probably be scratching the surface. Because if you don't have, this is my addition to this, and I digress. If you don't have public policy support, right now in Memphis, the official Black Lives Matter Memphis chapter, the Coalition of Concerned Citizens, my dear brother Keegan Franklin. I'm sure Sister Reach is involved in this. Abyssinian to a degree is involved in this. Up the Vote 901 is involved in this. We're responding to people who have water issues. But all of us put together can't absolve the fuckery of Memphis Light, Gas, and Water's bad infrastructure, because that's policy. So until we quick sometimes to attack not just the mega churches, the everyday ordinary churches who just struggling with their nickels and dimes, asking Charisse for money to pay for their, streaming equipment. Okay, right? And I'm not saying that we should not critique the church. We should. We have to hold it to the standard of a liberationist theology. But when you start talking about what impact, like so much of this that's happening at the church is a reflection of what's happening in the broader community. That's not what it should be, but that's just what it is. And unless we are going to address the public policy issues that keep causing so much harm, even if I had 2,500 members, I ain't got 200, but even if I had 2,500 members, there are over 650,000 people in the city of Memphis. So if I helped 20,000, that's still just a drop in the bucket. If 10 pastors help 20,000 apiece, you still have over half the city that is going to be left out to dry. So I hope when we start thinking about what the response should be and how to really reduce the harm, we make sure we adequately and equitably leverage some of our critiques on policy and government in ways that provide a broader and faster impact. Thank y'all.
One thing I want to add real quick.
Right here.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. I want to add one thing real quick. Everything that we're talking about has to do with the Black church harm reduction, and it's not just one system of oppression. It's the carceral systems that affect us all. And I digress for 1 second just to say, if you don't know what carceral systems mean, it means basically the systems that intertwine with one and another, one upon another. Okay, so all these systems, for instance, we talked about mass incarceration. Mass incarceration deals with how many different organizations? Okay, you got to deal with the justice system. You got to deal with the judge, the prosecutor, the guards of the prison, the police, and so on. The DOJ, DOC, all of this. Those are carceral systems. That's just one system. But now when you're dealing with someone who may be dealing with some type of court, then you may deal with ACS. You may deal with the probation officer or parole officer, all of these different systems that work, and they all working together. So as the pastor just stated, we have to attack these policies, address these policies and these systems that are in place. And as I said earlier, these systems are doing exactly what they're supposed to do. It's by design. To keep us divided, keep us separated, keep us oppressed. Now, the question is, what have we done? In harm reduction, for the Harm Reduction Coalition, there's a lot of work that we have done as far as providing technical assistance, trainings, and going out in the community. And they have done, they have assisted in working with a group called the Peer Network of New York. While everyone else was shutting down, the Peer Network of New York were fisher of men. And what I mean by that is, while everybody else shut down here in New York City, this particular organization, along with the help of the National Harm Reduction Coalition, went out in the community and provided people with harm reduction equipment, provided people with PPE gear and information and resources to what was going on in the community and what they needed to know. Also, they created a thing, a virtual, they couldn't have monthly meetings, so they created Instead of meeting once a month, they created something that they called safe spaces. Now we know that, and it's during coronavirus, they was talking about social distancing. Now we know that social distancing isn't just physical distancing, but physical isolation is what some people were going through. So this had to play on some people's mental health. Now, the government or the powers that be wasn't talking about people's mental health at first. They wasn't talking about the homeless people's needs or the drug using community's needs, or even trying to put porta johns out in the community, hand wash stations out in the community, and things that were needed. Now, we couldn't do all of that, but what that organization, the Peer Network, what they did was they did coat drives. They did food harm reduction outreach and food, big food events for the community. Now you have all these other organizations that were getting paid all this money to do this same work, and little to no work got done. But an organization, that gets slim to no money was able to do or continue to strive to do the best they can. And yes, like the pastor just said, it was only a drop in the bucket because it was only one part of the Bronx. You know what I mean? And if they had the money, they could have did more. But if more organizations come together, they could have been so much more done. But the thing is that we have to find ways to do the work that needs to be done, the work that we're called to do. I don't call myself a Christian. I call myself a righteous person. And what I mean by that is I don't judge myself. I let my deeds speak for itself. Trying to live and attempting to live a righteous life means that I have to do the best I can at what I can do, not just for myself, but for my fellow man. And that's to do better. There was a time when I was homeless. And it was hard to do certain things and certain things to happen. So I know what it's like to be without a coat. In New York here, it was cold. People saying they don't want to go out because of coronavirus. Well, put on a mask, put on your gloves, whatever you got to do. But people still need things out there in the community. If you teach, I can give you a fish or I can teach you how to fish. And you can feed yourself. Some of these people are in situations in the community where they don't trust. But you know how many thank yous individuals from the Peer Network and the Harm Reduction Coalition and other that was affiliated with us got? How many thank yous for being out there in the cold, giving away food, giving away coats, socks, hats, and gloves? Just simply thank you. I'm glad y'all are out here. I'm glad you're doing this. And no one's doing it for a paycheck. It's about giving of oneself. What was talked about earlier, just doing what you know needs to be done in the community. The hard part is getting the people out of office and getting the people who make the laws and change the policies, getting them to see what's being done and what needs to be done. Every time you talk to a politician, the first thing that they tell you is what? The first question out their mouth is, how much is it going to cost? Well, for me, it's about saving a life. So how much is a life worth? Realistically, we're talking about saving and changing people's lives. You asking me how much does it cost? How much is an individual life's worth to you? Now, the thing is that when we try to talk to politicians and things like that, we want to make sure that we have people from their district sitting in the room to hear them speak. Are you acknowledging that there's a need? Are you going to address the need? When it comes to community organizing, there's different ways to go about it and how we do things. As far as even with Vocal New York, whether it's going to city council, going to city hall, going to our state capitol, or going to DC. At some point, you have to hold people to what they said they was gonna do. Because everybody, when they running for office, they're gonna tell you everything they think you want to hear. But I have one question to think about it before you support someone running for office or whatever the case may be, because this is a form of harm reduction. Because let's get it straight. Harm reduction is not just about drugs and or alcohol. And that's the biggest misconception there is. Harm reduction can be a way of life if you implement it in your life. Because when I get in the car and I put that seatbelt on, guess what? That's harm reduction. I tie my shoes up because they got laces on it. I don't want to go downstairs and trip on them laces. That's harm reduction. Think about people first and center. Language is powerful. That's one thing that is so important. Language and what we say and the terms that we use. Addict. We don't use that term. Because a person chose to use drugs at some point in their life, that don't make them an addict. They still are whoever they are. They ain't a dope fiend. They ain't a crackhead. They ain't this. They ain't that. They are a person. That's someone's loved one. And that's how we need to remember it is, and how we allow people to speak to us. Education goes a long way. And this is our duty to educate ourselves as well as the community around all these issues and these topics we're talking about. So that way a person can make an informed decision. First rule of harm reduction. Inform, educate, so to allow the individual to make an informed decision around whatever and any topic we're dealing with. I may think they may want to go this way, but I'm gonna use something. In harm reduction, all I am is a GPS. A new GPS, not the ones that first came out. I'm a newer, up-to-date GPS, because I ain't like the ones that when they first came out. You know what I mean? So I'm an up-to-date, new version, 2021 of a GPS. And all that person does for me is to give me directions and where they want to go, and I assist them to get to wherever they want to go. It's not where I think they should go, or you need to go to a detox. The worst thing is we have a housing crisis in this country. We have an opioid crisis in this country. We have a rent crisis right now in this country. The list goes on. The Black church and harm reduction coming together, addressing these policies, can make a difference. No revolution has worked in this country. The civil rights movement would not have worked without the Black church. The civil rights movement would not have worked without the college students. See, you get the Black church, you get the college students, and then you get the people to come together. With those three coming together, you have a legitimate movement that will make change. It's not one or the other. You got to have it all together. That's why it's about inclusion. Respect and dignity. It don't make sense for me to sit down and always talk to like-minded people. Why is it that so many of us only want to talk to like-minded people? So we can get the bobblehead effect and sound good when we're talking. Do we know how to have a dialogue with people who may not agree with us? My job ain't to change their mind. I know I'm going to provide them with facts that they can research and look up. It's up to them to change their mind. But I provided them with facts. Facts that they may never have gotten if they didn't sit down and have a conversation. We have to be willing to educate and talk to people within the community. We have to remember to bring up people. We have to remember that, we don't have to shame anyone, but we all have to do better in what we do for ourselves and for our community and our people. And the main thing is these policies as they are written. These policies were not written by us. They were not written for us. So when we say the war on drugs, I say, hell no, it's a war on people, just like it was designed for. It's not a war on drugs, it never was. It was a war on people, predominantly Black people. At this time, when the war on drugs started, there was only 250,000 people in the United States prison system. Now it's over 2.5 million people in the United States prison system because of the war on people. Let's understand that. You understand the difference of a gentle or drug war. Wait a minute. What's gentle about war? There ain't nothing gentle about war. Except the policies now that you have where you was locking people that look like me up and came from where I came from up and separating and destroying the family. Now you want to create, and don't get me wrong, I'm glad you're creating all these services, but these services that you're creating have to be equal for all people to get into now. Now that you got something gentle, but don't say a gentle or drug war, because that's a connotation that I can't accept, because there's nothing gentle about war, period. It wasn't gentle when you was locking us up. And the opioid crisis is nothing new. Let's get that straight. In my hood, we done had an opioid crisis since the 1960s, maybe before then. So this is nothing new. And I'm gonna leave by saying this. The systems are doing exactly what they were designed to do, period. Don't think that they went awry or they're making a mistake. No, they're doing exactly what they was designed to do. And the last thing I'm gonna say is look up the definition in the dictionary of American. 1878 definition of American, and see what an American is. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Haya. And I want to be 100% transparent. I want to ask this next question. It'll be our final question. Y'all, we only asked one question. We're going to ask two. And with that being said, if you have to jump off at the appointed end time, please do govern yourselves accordingly. I'm going to ask this question to the full panel, and those of you who have to exit at your hard stopping point, if you could please let me know in the chat box so that I can get you on first so that you can say your answer. And then those of us who can stay a few minutes longer, if you'll give me that nod as well. The initial question or initial purpose of the conversation was to talk about the opportunities and challenges that we meet when we bring together harm reduction in the Black church. What is one thing that you would like to leave this audience with today concerning that purpose? Pastor Earl, I'm going to start with you if that is okay.
Yep, just repeat it one more time so I can make sure I address it. What's the one thing that
you would like to leave this audience with today concerning our purpose, which was to talk about the opportunities and challenges of bringing harm reduction in the Black church together?
I would like to leave with everybody, you know, a re-emphasis on the complexity of the problem, which is that the harm reduction reality is both philosophical and practical. And that if we don't adequately analyze the power dynamics and leverage our resources in ways that respond to where the needs are most pressing and what the root causes are, then I think we'll end up spinning our wheels. I mean, Hiawatha was laying out like some of the sophisticated methodologies that a white supremacist structure has engaged in over the last, 50 to 100, 400 years, right? And if all we do is try to respond to one institution or one organization outside of the broader organizations that may represent some of these challenges, but don't ultimately steer the ship, if you will, then I think that's how you end up, what they call an ambulance chasing, or running nowhere fast. But well, you said one thing. Let me say this is 1A, okay? Because that's the thing, and within that, I'm saying, I believe we are at a space where it would be better for us to highlight, amplify, support, and resource those Black churches that we see trying to do the work than it is to spend our time constantly bashing. And some of these churches, they deserve to be bashed, okay? I'm saying equitably apply your intellectual, your theological, your financial, your human capital and energy Because here's what I think anybody who knows anything about Memphis in the last 10 years knows. Charisse can amen this. Matter of fact, I'm gonna say this and I'm done. If Abyssinian Missionary Baptist Church had half of the budget of some of these other churches, Lord have mercy, it would be a completely different ballgame. But what you have is, and I know Cherise, when she said this earlier, I agree with the sentiment and it'll shout you, but sometimes the practical reality of it is like, if you just do the work, the people gonna come. In this day and age, with so much consumerism and so much opportunism and so much smoke and mirrors, it'll take my wife to preach to you about how many people come trying to latch on to the Pastor Earl show, if you will, right? Or whatever it is, but don't really invest nothing. Don't really invest no time, don't really invest no talent, don't really invest no treasure. And then, it's like the revolving door. So that's the thing. So it's a two-part, it's one thing, Dr. O, but it's two parts. One is, let's leverage our critiques and our efforts against a system where it needs to be leveraged. But at the same time, let us also, instead of spending a lot of time from the Black church standpoint, talking about what these 5%, 10%, 25%, 95% of Black churches aren't doing. If you find one, go give your money, give your time, give all of your talent, and talk about that good church more than you talk about the bad church.
Cherise.
Yes, Reverend Earl. Yes, Reverend Earl. Right. I love, that you lifted up the issue around critique, because I do think that the critique piece has, we're just resting there a little bit too long, right? And it's not to say that it's not warranted, but it does mean to say that we are placing energy in a space that isn't going to produce fruit. It's not going to produce outcomes that really move this conversation forward. I think what I wanted to lift up is for folks who are trying to work with the Black church, folks who might be a part of the Black church on this call, folks who have been harmed by the Black church, is that really, what I would like to see is a realigning of evangelistic values, right? It's time to legit align our work, our ministry work, with what's happening to the people. Right, what's going on in our communities, that we no longer can hide behind, the organ, the tambourines, a hoop, because none of those things are getting us free, right? That people are hungry and they desire a worship experience that speaks to their very practical, natural needs, while supporting their spiritual needs and helping to to empower that piece of them so that they can maintain their natural day-to-day. You know what I mean? So I just really want to see that happen more intentionally than I have seen. I work really hard on the national level to kind of stay in these types of and stay in these national conversations, because I know that everybody's trying to figure out how to work with faith communities. Folks are trying to figure out how to kind of get their agenda with, in folks' pulpits, recognizing that more conservative practices have figured out, how to align themselves with folks in the faith community. But what I would also want to say is to even echo what Pastor Earl is saying, is that those folks are coming with money, that we are expecting churches to get on board to our cause without investing in those churches, right? So when Reverend Earl called on me, I'm looking at my budget like, okay, I know I can figure out something to give to Reverend Earl, if not everything that he has asked me for, because I see him doing the work. I don't see everybody doing the work, and I'm saying that as an advocate, and I'm saying that as a Christian, right? And it's time out for us, kind of, if you will, casting our pearls to the swine, especially when the swine is capitalism, especially when the swine is form and fashion, right? That we absolutely have to now start to figure out how we redirect dollars and put it in the hands of folks with education, with training, right? Because I also don't think that just because you are a Black church with power and influence, that you might not be the most appropriate messenger to get the work accomplished, right? And so I think that that's the other thing. Everybody ain't Dr. King, right? Everybody's not willing to die either, right? And so I think that we've got to also, think about to think about, like, what is the role that I am willing to play what level of sacrifice am I willing to give? But how can we connect our resources in a way that moves us forward, right? That moves the conversation forward to reducing harm. And again, this broader understanding of harm reduction means, so there's no need to keep asking people on food stamps for tithes if you already know that they can't afford to eat, right? How is that fully aligned with that request? And some might say you still gotta, you gotta step out on faith. Well, okay, well, you still gotta think about folks' natural needs while you're trying to minister to their spiritual needs, right? Then we've gotta also, I think another piece I wanted to lift up was, though we are talking about the Black church, which is really, I think we're talking more about brick and mortar than we're talking about the people that sit in the pews, right? So let's get back to the people in the pews. Let's get back to evangelism. Let's get back to meeting people at a point of need, hunger, right? If there's a church on every corner in Memphis, and I used to live in Chicago. There's a church on every other corner in Chicago, and yet there are homeless people all over the country. There are homeless people all over those cities, right? If every church that was investing in trying to, figure out how to help those people get off the from being unhoused, then I think we can see something that is substantial. My thing is, what are all these churches empty right now during COVID, right? For those who have the infrastructure to do so, because some do not, right? But I say that with the understanding that I got an Abyssinia Baptist Church in my head that's giving everything on crumbs, while I see mega churches giving nothing. Right. I think one of the deepest things was, there was I think it was a New Orleans based church. I feel like it was like maybe Pastor Osteen's church. Is that in New Orleans? Is that a New Orleans based or a Texas based church?
Yeah, that's in Houston.
Houston, Texas, right? Like folks kind of coming for that particular ministry because of the level of resource that they had in the midst of people being flooded out or people going through different types of like calamity. I just think that those folks have a little bit more infrastructure than the Abyssinia Baptist Church, right? And so I just had a different level of expectation. Maybe that's judgment, maybe that's shame. I'm not trying to judge or shame. I'm just saying, where are we placing our resources? The resources that we're being given to do, for building funds, right? That could definitely be reapplied into definitely addressing some of those more practical needs that the people in the pews have. I can hear you better if I ain't hungry. You see what I'm saying? I can hear you better if I'm not homeless. I can hear you better if I am well, right? But I can't hear you come for me about my spiritual life if my natural needs are not met, right? So I think that, for every preacher and pastor that is on here who has the ability to make those levels of shift and change, right? That this is the focus that I want to see us kind of realign our focus so that we can help folks, so we can help build kingdom with healthy, sustainable people that build healthy and sustainable communities. Thank you, guys.
Jawanza.
So first, I just want to say I'm very honored to have been invited to this space, especially to be with Hiawatha with Reverend Earl and Cherise. I think I just want to also echo everything that they both have said. I'm going to be thinking about that for myself and just how I move forward. But I really feel good too. Whenever Pastor Earl mentioned, talk about this church that you like a lot, I make a point to talk about Middle, and I try to do what I can do to support it. And I probably will be becoming a tithing member at Pastor Earl's church now. But my point is, I think it's very important that to take away from this conversation, from the perspective of a person interested in building movements, that you've got to understand your institution as a sort of a part of the process of what it means to transform the society, and not just individuals' sort of spiritual experience. One of the things that I appreciate most about Reverend Jackie Lewis's sort of framing of theology and the sort of mission of Middle Church is this idea, and I think Cherise talked about it some, is about building what we say God's kingdom on earth, to sort of remove the gender factor from it. But like when people, I've always had a real problem with the idea of rapture. There's the idea, or the way that it's framed, at least in the popular consciousness, that our work is to separate ourselves from the world and await a cloud, you know, with seat for just a few of us to hop in, and Jesus is going to take us off and destroy everything else. I think what we're actually called to is this concept called metanoia, which means not just to repent, not don't do that, don't do this, in this very binary, very, you know, really, I think white supremacist capitalist framework of like theology and understanding of the world, like this is good, this is bad, X, Y, Z. It just, the reality is that it's a lot more complicated than that. And that our work is to, you know, create heaven on earth. Like, you know, in heaven, if you ask for what it looks like, what they'll say is there's no suffering, there's no death, there's obviously no homelessness, there's no drug overdoses. So like these things are not, you know, outside of the realm of what's possible in this dominion, in this sort of like physical material world. We have the power and the ability and the knowledge and the skill sets to be able to eliminate homelessness, to relegate homelessness to a barbaric past. We have the power to end overdose. We have the power to extend people's lives for much further than they go today. Not that we are searching for immortality, but we want to create the conditions, you know, that bring us closer to what God intended for us in the very beginning, in the first place. In most theologies that I've been exposed to, understand this idea, this Eden, this like, we weren't supposed to experience the suffering. The suffering is the result of us not transforming. So when I think about movement work, when I think about, quote, lamenting in the streets, you know, we need to be transforming not just what we're doing, but who we are. And I think that so much of it has to happen on a collective scale. And I deeply appreciate the way that Reverend Earl talked about, you know, no matter, even if we put all of our, even if the Joel Osteens of the world gave all their money away, which it would be, you know, a lot of money for Joel Osteen. But like, my point is, it wouldn't end homelessness. It wouldn't provide healthcare for every single person in this country. So what I'm saying is that if we're going to engage in transmutation, like when we go to take communion and we transform that wine into the blood of Christ, when we transform that blood into the body of Christ, we need to be engaged in a public transmutation when it comes to policy. What does it mean for us to use our hands, as we're called to, for healing the world, to demand that we pass Medicare for all, to demand that we implement the Green New Deal, that we address the climate crisis, that we, you know, in homelessness, that we pass the homes guarantee, that we begin to have a truth and reconciliation and reparations for the descendants of enslaved Africans in this country. All of this stuff is a spiritual work. And it's not like, so, you know, Black feminist theory and politics and theology has really helped me sort of open my eyes and look at the world through many lenses. And I don't think, like to me, a movement, a direct action, it is an active prayer. It is a physical thing. It's like, we're not supposed to just ask for things. We're supposed to be in struggle with the world. It's not just a struggle within you towards Christ or to be more like Christ, but it's about, you know, struggling with these unforeseen powers. Remember those powers that Romans 8 talks about that cannot separate us from the love of God. You know, the challenge is the rebukes that suggest that somehow if your faith institution is creating a safe space for people to use drugs so that you can offer them healthcare services, so you can offer them housing assistance, so you can offer them psychological or emotional counseling, you've already been told the good news that you are sanctioned to do those things. And I think that we need to do that on a collective scale. So I think that, you know, if your church is not a part of the Repairs of the Breach, it's a network, join it. If your church is not a part of the Poor People's Campaign, it needs to be a part of it. You know, and you don't have to think only in the sort of like traditional spiritual context. You know, I think that there's two national networks, progressive networks that Vocal New York is part of, that I really support, called People's Action Network and the Center for Popular Democracy. There is space in these places for faith traditions to re-engage. And so many people understand and come to things as people searching for God. And I think that we should be finding God in the pursuit of liberating people from jails, of making sure that they have, you know, the medicines and the love and the care that they need. To me, I don't know how, that's how I got to God. And I think that's why I'm still here. So thank you all so much.
Thank you so much, Jawanza. Hiawatha.
Real quick, I'm just gonna say it's it's simple, but it's not simple at the same time. We heard so many things that were said from the other eloquent panelists. a couple I didn't know, that I know now and have so much respect for. But I'm gonna say the main thing is I must end with what I started off with: love, love for your fellow being, um, and inclusion of others, and working together. I mean, sometimes we sit down and we have conversations and we work towards things, but we we don't work at the implementation that creates the actual change. And what we need to do is to work at the implementation of what is going to be that actual change so we can have a better society. So I mean, I would just ask everyone for more love, more inclusion, and more working towards not just sitting down and having conversations, but creating the dialogue that's going to create change, and then working on that implementation to change. Thank you.
I would like to extend extreme ecstatic thank you to all of the panelists. I would like to thank the leadership of Faith and Harm Reduction and the staff, all who participated in making this moment possible and making this happen. I appreciate all of you who have participated in this conversation in any way for your trust in me to lead and moderate this conversation. And I've already told y'all we only got to 2 questions. So I've let Sarah know we need to figure out how to have the rest of this conversation because we just scratched the surface today. It's got to be a part 2 for this. So I'm gonna leave that in you guys' hands, but I do want to say again, a hats off to everybody who participated. And please, please, please do keep in touch with the Faith and Harm Reduction family. Erica, I'll pass to you. It's your baby, so your voice should be the last voice that's heard.
I just am incredibly, incredibly grateful for everybody's participation today. This was life-giving, and I could not be more ecstatic to be kind of rumbling through these considerations and contemplations with you all. So I hope that folks will stay in touch with Faith and Harm Reduction. 100%. We need to have a round 2. And with that, go and be well.